Thanks again for joining us at the Competitive Advantage Talks presented by CAGR, also known as the Craft Analytics Group. My name is Matt Toy, and I'm an MBA student at MIT Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce the presentation, How AI and This One Metric Can Reshape NFL Roster Decisions. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Joel Shapiro, professor at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University, to the stage.
All right, thanks for having me here. Thanks for the nice intro. I'm Joel Shapiro at the Kellogg School of Management. I'm a professor of managerial economics and decision sciences. And this is not the slide that I had put up here. Okay, but we'll roll with it. I want to tell you a story about this teal dot. A little more information on this slide than intended, but bear with me here. I want to tell you a story about this teal dot. This teal dot represents the 2021 Miami Dolphins. The season for the Miami Dolphins was kind of an interesting one. They won their first game of the season against the Patriots, who were a pretty good team that year, and then went on to lose their next 7 games. Totally out of the playoff hunt, right? Well, not so fast, because the Dolphins then won their next 7 games, got back into the playoff hunt, and then split their last 2 games of the season to go 9-8 and miss the playoffs by only 1 game. It was a disappointing but kind of exciting end to the season. There's a lot you could say about the Dolphins' 2021 season, but the one thing that you could not say is, man, if only they had been healthier. In fact, the Dolphins were a pretty healthy team that year, and that's what this graphic here shows. The vertical axis of this graph shows their win percentage for that season. They were 9-8, so a little bit above 500. And the horizontal axis shows this thing called percent cash wasted. And that's a metric that I have used some AI to come up with and think about the importance of, and it represents the percentage of a team's payroll that is spent on players that are injured in a given year. Now, the Dolphins in 2021 spent about 7% of their payroll on injured players, and the league average is right around 10%. And just to give you a better sense of what percent cash wasted means, imagine that you have one player on a team that makes $10 million a year and misses 30% of their season. That would be like $3 million cash wasted. We could argue whether that's the right word. If that team had a $100 million payroll and that were the only player that got injured, that would be 3% cash wasted. The Dolphins were to the left of this line, this league average. Now, I want you to contrast that with this gold dot. This gold dot represents the 2021 New Orleans Saints. They also went 9-8 and also missed the playoffs by 1 game that year. But they were hit pretty hard by the injury bug. They lost 22% of their total payroll to injury that year. They had 4 different starting quarterbacks. They had starting lineman, running back, and wide receiver who all missed pretty significant time. When you look at the 2021 New Orleans Saints, about the only thing that you can do is look at that team and say, man, if only they had been healthy, what could have been possible? These are the stories that aggregate to trends that distill into insights that I study and that I explore as my role as a professor at the Kellogg School of Management. I lead something called Kellogg's Analytical Consulting Lab, where we explore how new metrics and new data can help us figure out how teams can get better. We're in the middle right now of finishing up a really cool project with the NFL. We had some students over at the NFL headquarters in New York just last weekend. Last year, I got to present on AI in sports at the NFL's winter meetings, which was really cool. And I think, as you can tell from this picture here from 1979, as that ball goes right under my glove, I'm weirdly locked onto the bag, right, as that ground ball comes to me. I think it's very clear that if I was going to have a career in professional sports, it was going to be with math and not necessarily with my glove, right? Although I was a pretty decent hitter. What I do is I use statistics and I use AI to help find stories that essentially unlock performance and help teams fulfill their potential. So why percent cash wasted? Why this one metric? And by the way, I'm not going to stand up here and claim that this is the one silver bullet for everybody. It is one of multiple metrics that can help teams get better. But why percent cash wasted? Because injuries matter. Now, we all knew that, right? If players get injured, fans are unhappy because they don't get to see their favorite players, but also teams win fewer games when their players are injured. I don't just set out to understand whether injury matters, but how much it matters. And this is a really important distinction. Until we know how big a problem something is, until we can quantify it and actually come up with an empirical estimate, it becomes incredibly difficult to figure out whether we should solve for that problem or know how much is reasonable to invest in solving for that problem. And then most importantly, what can teams do about it? And as I went out and looked at these posters in the lobby, there's a lot of really cool stuff out there. But one thing I want you to keep in mind, for those of you who are thinking about careers in the space and so forth, is that there should always be something actionable about the work you do. I have analyzed data like many of you just because it's interesting, totally, and I think that's great and keep doing it. But if you want to actually be paid for something, it's got to be that there's some sort of action to be taken or decision to be made because of it. These are the kinds of things that I wrote about in an article that was probably the most read thing that I've ever written. Will AI replace the front office in pro sports? This was in Harvard Business Review, summer of 2023. You know the answer to the question. No, it's not going to replace the front office, but those executives that use AI are going to be much better positioned to win than those who don't. So how much does it matter? How much does percent cash wasted matter? This is data from the NFL from 2012 through 2022, an 11-year time period. And the data was provided to me by a company called Probability AI. They are worth you knowing. Not probability, but Probability AI. This is a company, a startup from Kellogg grads. They founded this company. I advise them, and they have a spectacular data set that allows us to mine it and plumb it for really interesting things that I've never seen anybody else be able to do before. This graphic is from a Sports Business Journal article. They just featured this in their last November edition, just this last November. And you can see that percent cash wasted matters, not surprisingly. As you waste more cash due to injury, your likelihood of making the playoffs drops, and quite precipitously. Looking at how injuries and how expensive injuries affect team success can be done in a couple of different ways. One is how likely is a team to make the playoffs, but there's another metric that I use, and that's win percentage. After all, playoff thresholds move from year to year, so it gets a little hard to compare year over year. So win percentage is a little bit more consistent. And the magnitude of the relationship between percent cash wasted and win percentage is shown by this line, which is essentially a 1-to-1 ratio. That is, for every additional 1% cash wasted due to injury, your win percentage goes down by 1%. So if you're at like the league average of 10% cash wasted and that goes up to 11%, you could expect your win percentage to go from 50% down to 49%. Now, I don't totally think of it like that. What I like to ask is, what would a team have to do in the NFL to win one more game in a season? Well, one game, 1 out of 17, is about 5.9%. So to increase your win percentage by 5.9 percentage points, you need to reduce your percent cash wasted by 5.9 percentage points. That's what you need to do to win one more game in the NFL. That's not a small amount. And it's not necessarily always relevant to every team. Now, here's what I mean by that. This is the actual data around that line. There's a lot of variation. Every dot here is a team year. The 2021 Saints, the 2021 Dolphins, they're in there. It's about 11 years times about 30 teams, so about 300 or so dots on this screen here. What I'm interested in is how teams can address in-season volatility. That is, how can they manage risk in a given season to make sure that they are creating optimal rosters relative to that risk? Now, there are potentially some systematic team issues that come out of this. Here, let me explain what I mean. This total jumble of a screen here shows a line for each team in the NFL in that 2012 to 2022 time period. The blue lines represent what we would expect. The blue line, the downward sloping line, is a team where more percent cash wasted means less winning games. But there are some anomalies here. There are like 7 teams, and I've highlighted those in red, where the line slopes upwards, which means more percent cash wasted is more winning. Those tend to be driven by just like 1 or 2 outliers. But the bigger point is this. Yes, there are some potential team issues going on. Over these 11 years, there were teams that had greater percent cash wasted. Teams like Washington, the Niners, Green Bay, they tended to have high levels of percent cash wasted over this time period, whereas like the Vikings and the Eagles, the Falcons were really low in this time period. But nothing in the data necessarily suggests that that's good or bad decision making. I can't differentiate that from good or bad luck. Again, I'm not addressing at the team level that I know that there are teams that are really good or really bad at this. It's about this notion of mitigating risk within season. Now, I think the variation around this line also leads to a really interesting story here about which teams actually can benefit from better understanding how much cash they're likely to waste. And that really becomes the core of this, because AI can be used to forecast future events, like performance and like injury. I think of the variation on this line as identifying 4 distinct groups, 4 quadrants on this graph. And because I'm a business school professor, I'm contractually obligated to give them ridiculously cutesy names for each segment, right? The upper right are what I call the fortunate few. That's because these were teams that had high levels of injury. They had higher than average percent cash wasted, but they still won a lot of games. If they could have peered into the future and said, boy, we're going to be in that quadrant, would we do anything differently? Probably not. They were already making the playoffs, and sure, had they been healthier, maybe they would have had a slightly better seed in the playoffs and done better, perhaps. But in general, the season was a success. Similarly, the bottom left quadrant, the healthy hapless, they were already really healthy, and they still didn't win any games. Nobody looks and says, we're going to be in that quadrant. If only we had been healthier. There's just not a lot of room to get much healthier. But about 60% of the data points don't lie in these quadrants, but rather in the other 2 quadrants where arguably injury was really important to them. The durable dominators, I grant you my names got really bad for this, and I had to turn to ChatGPT for it, and I'm not feeling great about it. But the durable dominators in the upper left, those are the ones that were healthy and won games, and at least part of their success may certainly have been due to the fact that they were healthy. And then in the bottom right, those walking wounded. The walking wounded were not healthy, they were highly injured, and did not make the playoffs, and we could certainly argue that their high levels of injury might have been a cause for that. These are the individuals, these are the teams, the team seasons where peering into the future could and probably would have been very helpful if we could use AI to get better sense of what the level of risk for a team in a given season is. Now look, I grant you that you could, if you were in the walking wounded, you could say, well, look, all we want to do is make the playoffs. Why don't we just try and become one of those fortunate few? That would be really weird. It would be a little strange for a team to be like, we know we're going to be really injured next year and we might suffer because of it, so let's forget about the injury and just try harder. Or spend a lot of money so we can win more games. Like if your solution for a team is ever, let's just dump money at it, that is not what I mean by a really good actionable recommendation. Rather, if you know that you're at risk of lots of injury and that's going to complicate or sort of compromise your performance, you're going to think about using health and risk mitigation as a lever to get healthier, to waste less cash, and to plan appropriately so you win more games. So I tend to think of this as going from that walking wounded category and moving you to the durable dominators, and if you're in the durable dominators, to do whatever you can to try and stay there. To me, this really becomes the key towards understanding how AI helps us in team composition. It's about risk mitigation. It's about understanding what kind of risk you can afford. And it's about understanding what kind of depth you might need in a given season. A lot of depth, a little bit. What happens when you face injury at the beginning of the season or even in the middle of the season? How likely is that to impact your chances of winning? And what, if anything, can you do about it? And this becomes the key question. What can teams do differently? As I said before, I don't want to oversell percent cash wasted as like the single metric, even though that's totally the clickbaity title of this talk right now, this one single metric. But this is one of a handful of metrics that we can use to help teams get better. AI has the potential of basically telling us that we should see things that we didn't even know we needed to see. And if we can act on those things and glean insights from those hidden stories, we have the potential to get competitive advantage with data. That's where it lies. So what can they do differently? Well, first of all, injury and performance are in fact predictable. Don't let people tell you otherwise. There's this narrative right now that like predicting player injury is like a failed use case. That's a load of BS. It's not. And I encourage you as you go through the conference today and tomorrow and you read and you explore, differentiate between people who have actually collected, cleaned, curated, and analyzed data versus those who haven't. At Probability, I've had this awesome data set that allows me to actually do these things and actually show myself that prediction and performance is in fact predictable. Not perfectly, but enough that it helps us make better decisions. Problem is, predicting something like injury and preventing it, totally different things. I've talked to a number of different trainers in the NFL, in the Northwestern Athletic Department, and some others, and I've said to them, look, if you knew that a certain player was at higher risk of injury next year, what would you do differently? And they frequently will say, I don't know. Look, if somebody breaks their arm because they fell weirdly, like, how do you prevent that? Accidents happen. The only way you prevent that is by keeping somebody off the playing field, which is a terrible solution. And they'll say, if somebody has a soft tissue injury, rotator cuff tear, like a strained hamstring, something like that, well, look, we already do everything we can to keep people strong and flexible. I'm not sure what else we could do. So prediction is not the same as prevention. And that leaves us with executive decision-making to understand how best to build rosters in a way that mitigate this risk that I've been talking about. When I talk about the next generation of sports leaders, and by the way, it's a little bit of current generation of sports leaders too, but the next generation of sports leaders are going to have a data mindset. And when I say a data mindset, I don't mean that we're going to be looking at line charts on screen all the time. And I don't mean that we're going to be looking at those, dynamic in-game win probabilities, which, come on, there's no way that those things are ever as correct as they sound. What I'm talking about is a much more sophisticated way of thinking about the management of their resources. It's about more precise player evaluation. That's using historical performance with biometrics and biomechanics to come up with actually good and relatively precise measures of how valuable a player is. Smarter risk management, as I mentioned before. We're going to use machine learning models, some people already are, assessing injury and contracts, various performance projections. And that's what leads into better resource allocation. Just like any executive needs to manage their resource allocation and their investments, so too do sports leaders when making the biggest decisions that they make, that is how much to spend on which players to bring onto their team. We improve payroll efficiency, find undervalued talent, and do our best to avoid unnecessary or overly costly risks. The end of this really is everything that I've just said. The next generation of sports leaders is going to be embracing metrics, whether percent cash wasted or other things, for AI-assisted roster construction, which is going to lead to smarter, more informed decisions. And if done well, it's going to lead to a little bit or even possibly a lot more winning. Thank you very much.
At this point, we have about 5 minutes for questions. Feel free to raise your hands, and I'll bring the mic to you. Don't ask your question until the mic is in your hand. Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering, as you discussed your percent cash wasted metric, if you've compared the association, the strength of the association with win percentage and percent cash wasted versus other injury metrics, just for instance, the number of games missed, number of snaps missed, that sort of a thing. Because, it's a great metric, but I'd like to see how much better it is compared to, the alternatives.
Yeah, so I've done some of that, but not all of it. So the problem is, so what I've done is I've looked at injuries generally, how many injuries. And I ended up at percent cash wasted because when I started sharing that with some people that I know, some executives in the NFL, they're like, what am I going to do with this? I'm making investments. I have to make real decisions that have real dollar figures associated with it. So the one thing that I can speak to is if I just look at number of injuries, there's almost no relationship that I've been able to find. But when you start weighting it by salary and amount of missed games, then it gets a little bit better. I haven't compared it to some of the other things that you mentioned. But again, I actually use this because at the urging of the executives, like, you got to give me better guidance than that. And also, by the way, wasting cash on offensive players, more harmful than defensive players. So I started to do some splits in that way.
Excuse me, guys, sorry.
Thank you for the presentation. That was great. Curious, in the percent cash wasted metric, was there any consideration given to players on rookie contracts having a lower cap hit, thinking a couple of years ago of Joe Burrow's injury derailing the Bengals season?
No, I mean, it's a great point. You're talking about weighting it by sort of some constraints that might exist around caps and so forth. Did not pay any special consideration to it. It was literally just cash out the door, people missing games, weighting it by that amount paid. But a good variation. I'm not sure how I build it in, but it's a good variation.
We have time for one or two more questions.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the so what, as we think about, you show percent cash wasted. I forget all your quadrant names, but if you're in that bottom right and you want to move to the top left, you also have a chance of moving to the bottom left. And there's a lot of variability in that kind of relationship. So how do I think about it if I'm an executive of how much do I invest in trying to reduce the percent cash wasted versus all of the other things I should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a great question, and in some ways it's the key question here. Any given player, you have the potential to understand more about their risk of injury than I think a lot of people acknowledge or think is even possible, especially when you start building in, like I said, publicly available data, biometrics, and biomechanical data, which oftentimes only the teams themselves actually have. So I think about it as if you recognize that there are enough players who are at risk of injury, you can start thinking about how to create backups or how to build a roster around certain, and this might start to get to a little bit of gut feel, certain people who you think if you lose them are going to be critical to the operation of your team. So I don't like the notion of you could create some sort of grand optimization model that is going to perfectly allow you to sort of put all of these things together. I think about it as each individual player will have some risk factor, and the executives then need to go in and figure out, given the level of risk for a given individual and the team generally, how do I best think about building depth in that way? And that becomes very, very case by case, of course, but that's how I think about it at that very individual level, even though percent cash wasted becomes this metric that is very much at a team level. I'm not sure how well I've answered your question, but it's how I think about it.
All right. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have, but thank you very much to Professor Joel Shapiro, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.